What is faith? Is doubt the enemy of faith? Is it possible to really have faith if you also have doubts? Depending on who you ask what is faith, you'll get very different answers to this question. If you ask an atheist, they might say something like, faith is believing things based on bad evidence. If you ask a learned Christian, they might quote Hebrews 11:1, which says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. If you ask a bunch of different Christians what that means and what faith means to them, you may get a wide variety of answers. However, there is agreement among all Christians that faith is important. I think Hebrews 11:6 emphasizes the significance of faith in the Christian life as clearly as any verse in the Bible. It says, and without faith it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. I plan to spend this episode talking about some of the reasons why there is disagreement, confusion, and misunderstandings about faith, as well as some of the negative consequences that sometimes come with thinking about faith in certain ways. At least part of the reason for the widely varying opinions is the fact that the word faith is used in at least a few different ways in Scripture and context that can give different impressions about its application or meaning, and because there are at least 6 related Greek words that are translated with these synonymous words: belief, faith, trust, confidence, fidelity, faithfulness, genuine, trustworthy, faithful, believing, convince, establish, give, assurance, persuade, and urge. I'm not a Greek speaker, so I can't say this with authority, but from what I can tell from the Strong's Concordance, these words appear to be various parts of speech that share common root words that all carry similar meanings to the range of English words that they're normally translated with. As a native English speaker, I have very different ideas in my head when I think about the words belief and faithfulness. I think about belief as meaning something like affirming a proposition as true, whereas faithfulness is much less about propositional beliefs and more about acting in accordance with what they believe or in accordance with the commitments they have made. There are some contexts in Scripture where these words are used that do appear to refer to nothing more than affirming something as true. But in other contexts, it seems clear to me at least that the writer had more in mind than communicating mere belief. If someone wants to read one of the passages that does appear to use these words to mean mere belief and infer that same meaning in every other scripture that uses the same word, then they might come up with an idea something like what I used to think. Depending on which verse someone is thinking about, and depending on the sort of ideas they have in their minds relating to words like faith, belief, and faithfulness, people may come to very different conclusions about what is required of them to have their prayers answered or to be saved. The way people think about these things can also influence the way they think about God's involvement in salvation and whether people have free will or not. Sometimes having a certain perspective about faith can produce what might be described as a phobia of learning, which can have a variety of effects such as trapping people in bad ideas, promoting closed-mindedness, engaging in confirmation bias, and sometimes even leading to the development of arrogance or an inability to correctly understand other people who think differently. I experienced most or maybe all these negative side effects for a long time because I developed what I now consider to be bad ideas about faith. I think the root of my problem had more to do with the related topic of doubt. When I was young, there was a pastor I heard give altar calls on a regular basis. He would always include the phrase, if you don't know beyond the shadow of a doubt, in his appeal to come down and accept salvation. Later I read James 1:6 and 7, which says, but let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. For a long time I thought that the strength of a person's faith was indicated primarily by how sure they were that what they believed was true. What I mean is that I thought my level of psychological certainty was a direct indicator of how strong my faith was, which I viewed as the main variable that would affect whether my prayers would be answered, and which might even be a factor that my salvation hinged on. Because of this, I put a lot of mental effort into trying to persuade myself to believe that my prayers were going to be answered, and I focused a lot of attention on reinforcing the beliefs I already had. I didn't know what confirmation bias was back then, but I was deeply affected by it. Since I thought my salvation hinged on having a high level of mental certainty that what I believed was right, I couldn't allow myself to really consider that I might be wrong about the things I already believed, because in my mind that would have indicated that my faith was actually very weak, which might jeopardize my salvation. This didn't really prevent me from learning new things, so long as they didn't create an obvious contradiction with what I already thought I knew. But once I did learn something new, and it became part of what I thought I needed to believe, it became a permanent part of the way I looked at the world, or at least I thought that way for a long time. I've come to see that nearly everything I once thought about faith is wrong. In reality, I don't think I was explicitly taught that faith is about having psychological certainty. I'm not even sure that the people I got this idea from had such a belief themselves. I do think that the things I was taught about faith were at least compatible with the sort of view I developed, because my journey of faith started in a way that is probably very similar to the way most people alive today started their own journey, by inheriting ideas from people who love us or from people we trust. Initially, I inherited most of my ideas about God from people I trusted, and in the area of faith, I inferred things from what I was taught explicitly and developed some misunderstandings about Scripture that seemed to fit both what I read and what I had been told. It makes perfect sense to think that people who love us would tell us the truth, and that therefore their testimony about such things should be reliable. The problem is that there are disagreements about nearly every subject, and people of all manner of opinions end up teaching their children, their students, or their congregations what they think. The bottom line is that there are lots of people who hold many different opinions who are teaching things that are not accurate. I'm not accusing anyone of teaching things they know to be false in order to intentionally mislead others. While I'm sure this has happened at various times in history by selfish people in positions to benefit from misinformed followers, I'm inclined to think that most people today are not in that category. I tend to think that most people care about their children, their students, and their congregations, and that they sincerely share what they believe to be the truth. However, people turn out to have a real weakness related to self-assessment about their own knowledge. Some of you may have heard of what has come to be known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. Think about this and see if it makes sense to you. All facts in the world can be grouped into one of 5 categories with respect to our knowledge about them. There are facts that we know that are true, facts we know that are actually wrong, facts we have forgotten we know, perhaps because these ideas have become so ordinary to us that they are just part of the given in our worldview, facts that we don't know, and facts that we don't know, perhaps because we know so little about a particular subject that we are unaware of the scope of facts that exist in that domain that could be known. If we're honest and actually think about it, I think we will all agree that the biggest fraction of facts that exist would fit into either the category of things we don't know or the things we don't know. If you think about a house a mile down the road from you and all the details of the lives of the people who live in that house, you should be able to recognize that you know next to nothing about those people, even though their lives are filled with innumerable complexities. Multiply that lack of knowledge by the billions of households around the world, and we are talking about a vast sea of ignorance. And that's just one tiny aspect of reality. There are many thousands of species of creatures on the earth, most of which most of us know very little about. If we knew all the details about all the living organisms on the planet, that would still leave most of the world unknown, since most of the world isn't even living. If you consider the magnitude of the universe with all its stars and planets in one direction, and the tiny stuff that we are made up of in the other direction, from organs to cells to molecules, atoms, and subatomic particles, you'll notice that we are in the middle of a system of incredible scale in both directions, most of which we are hopelessly ignorant about. We only perceive a tiny slice of reality, and most of that we ignore because it isn't actually relevant to what we value. My point is that we are all ignorant about almost everything on a scale that is hard to even imagine. There are lots of facets to the studies done that relate to the Dunning-Kruger effect that I remain ignorant about, but I've investigated enough to know that one of the primary findings of these studies is that low performers often significantly overestimate their own abilities. You might have noticed how sometimes it seems like the most ignorant people state their opinions with the most confidence. That turns out to actually be true. This series of studies has shown that one of the reasons this happens is that people who are the most ignorant actually know so little that they have yet to recognize the magnitude of truths that are out there to be known that they still don't know. They also know and understand so little that they aren't in a position to recognize their own deficiencies. We all start out something like that by virtue of being young. Unfortunately, there are already lots of bad ideas out there held by sincere and honest people who teach those bad ideas to their children while they're still young and impressionable. The normal response of a child is to believe the things told to them by people who love and care for them. It's also pretty normal to engage in confirmation bias by paying a lot more attention to the arguments that support your own beliefs than you pay to ideas that are contrary to your own beliefs. This is especially true when there are strong social or economic reasons to retain a particular belief. For example, people in some Islamic communities will sometimes inflict violence on their own family members if they reject Islam. Thankfully, Christian communities don't engage in violence to enforce their dogmas anymore, but for about 1,500 years, that was the norm. However, there are still strong social pressures surrounding a variety of Christian ideas. Many of the ideas I've addressed with these videos are in that category to some extent. Relationships sometimes suffer when a person changes their mind about an important religious question. People whose livelihoods depend on towing the party line, such as pastors and teachers, are also disincentivized against questioning popular dogma or ideas that are central to a community's identity. For a pastor to change his mind about a question like that will be to put his job in jeopardy. The truth is that we only have time to become proficient in so many areas, so we accept much of what we normally think of as knowledge on the basis of the confidence we have in the people who taught us. We really have little option but to do this a lot of the time, because in order to live a functional life, we can't spend all our time checking into every single thing that is taught to us as fact. We must make choices about how to spend our time and what subjects to investigate, if we investigate any at all. Unfortunately, ideas pertaining to religion are commonly left uninvestigated, and many people are content to leave such matters for others to investigate for them. My own understandings about what faith is turned out to be a major root that allowed most of the other bad ideas about God, the Bible, the world, and my role in it that I have had at various points in my life to persist for as long as they did. Because I believed that faith was mostly, if not entirely, about having a high level of psychological certainty that what I already believed was true, I became the perfect victim who was ready to swallow every sort of bad religious idea that was presented to me, so long as it was compatible with the previous bad ideas I had already swallowed. Some of the ideas I inherited have stood up to the intense scrutiny I have subjected them to over the last several years, but many did not. If I had not had an occasion that really pushed me to study the first controversy for myself, I probably wouldn't have done it at all. It wasn't until much later that I realized the role that my mistaken conception of faith had in the formation of the ideas I had, and the resistance I had against considering any opposing ideas. I found that having a certainty-seeking faith turned out to be counterproductive and destructive in my own life. So while sometimes faith, as used in the Bible, does refer simply to believing something, most often it seems to refer to faithfulness in living out our convictions. Hebrews 11, which is sometimes referred to as a chapter of faith, not only gives us a brief definition of faith and tell us that it is impossible to please God without faith, it also gives us several examples of people in Scripture who lived by faith, including Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Joseph, Moses, Rahab, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, the prophets, and others who are not named but whose deeds are listed. None of these people were commended for seeking psychological certainty, but they were all commended for the sort of life that they lived, in spite of the uncertainties that they experienced. They didn't earn their salvation through their faith. Their salvation was a gift from God, just like ours is, but they did live out their faith in action. James 2:17 says, "So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead." In my opinion, real biblical faith is living a life of obedience because of the belief that God exists and that He is the rewarder of those who seek Him, like it says in Hebrews 11:6. If this is so, then what are we supposed to think about the passages that talk about not doubting? James 1:6-7 is the one that caused me the most trouble. It says, "But let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord." The word translated here as doubt is the Greek word diakrino. The Strong's Concordance defines this word as to distinguish or to judge, and lists its usage as I separate, distinguish, discern one thing from another, or as I doubt, hesitate, or waver. The way that it's used, the translators have to decide how to best render the word based on the context it's used in. If we look at some of the other verses that use this same word in the context of faith or sin, we can see another way of thinking about this question, besides the idea of having psychological certainty that is free from doubts about what is true and whether God is going to respond positively to our prayers. For example, in the NIV, Romans 14:19-23 says, "Let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification. Do not destroy the work of God for the sake of food. All food is clean, but it is wrong for a person to eat anything that causes someone else to stumble. It is better not to eat meat or drink wine or to do anything else that will cause your brother or sister to fall. So whatever you believe about these things, keep between yourself and God. Blessed is the one who does not condemn himself by what he approves. But whoever has doubts is condemned if they eat, because their eating is not from faith, and everything that does not come from faith is sin." Now let me read verse 23 again from the Amplified Classic Translation. It says, "But the man who has doubts, misgivings, an uneasy conscience about eating, and then eats, perhaps because of you, stands condemned before God, because he is not true to his convictions, and he does not act from faith. For whatever does not originate and proceed from faith is sin. Whatever is done without a conviction of its approval by God is sinful." This is how the New Living Translation reads. But if you have doubts about whether or not you should eat something, you are sinning if you go ahead and do it, if you're not following your convictions. If you do anything you believe is not right, you are sinning. The Contemporary English Version reads this way: "If you do have doubts about what you eat, you are going against your beliefs. You know that is wrong, because anything you do against your beliefs is sin." If we go back to James 1:6 and 7, and take this understanding that the word diakrino can refer not merely to a doubt about psychological certainty about what is true, or whether God will definitely respond in the way we want to our prayers, but that it can also have to do with the vacillation of our motivations, convictions, and actions in terms of whether we will live faithfully in accordance with our convictions, we can see that James may not have been talking about psychological certainty at all. Pretty much all of James chapter 1 is about developing steadfastness and living a Christian life faithfully. Verse 5, which says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him." Then verse 6 says to ask in faith. Taken in the context of the rest of the chapter and in the book as a whole, I think it makes good sense to think that asking in faith with no doubting might be better understood in the sense of living faithfully without violating your conscience by doing things that would not be faithful to your commitment to God. This kind of understanding makes sense to me, because why would God give wisdom to a person who is living in sin, or with divided loyalties, or unfaithfully to the commitment he has made? That seems like a good reason to deny giving wisdom to someone. On the other hand, I see nothing admirable or praiseworthy in the ability to convince ourselves that what we already believe is true, or that God really will give us wisdom if we don't have any psychological doubts. I don't know of any place in Scripture where we are told explicitly that faith is ever about psychological certainty, and I no longer see any reason to think that way about this particular passage. I'm planning to do another episode about faith, exploring the question of whether we are asked to have blind faith, or if we are given evidence for the things we're asked to believe in Scripture. I think once you've considered the things I plan to present in the upcoming episode, that the case I've made in this episode will make even more sense. So look out for that episode. I hope you found this to be helpful. Please like and share the video, and subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified when new episodes come out. May God bless you.